Well, good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay back there? Welcome to our presentation. I thank everybody for coming down here today. It's a real privilege to be a part of a program like this, but we do have our work cut out for us. And so with that, I'm going to get going. We've got a lot to talk about. This program is dedicated to the men and women of the Union Pacific Railroad. And for those of us who have the very special opportunity to be involved in a program like this, this is our crew. This is the crew. The moment that we arrived back in California with the locomotive. What I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit. It's such a special experience that we had getting the locomotive ready to go and all the trials and tribulations, all the planning, all the hard work with such a small group of people. I'm going to kind of retrace some of those things. So for those of you that have seen the presentation last year, some of those slides are going to look familiar. So just bear with us and I'll kind of give you a little update from where we started and where we are now. So now we're going to back up a little bit. This is also dedicated to my near dear friend Ed. For those who knew Ed Gerlitz, great man. Well, there we are. The 4014 sitting out at the Los Angeles County Fair. Locomotive was donated in 1962, and the organization, the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society, sent a letter to the railroad asking for one of the big boys. Luckily, the Union Pacific had the forethought to save that class of locomotives, very thankfully. They very generously took the locomotive out of the what would have been the scrapping line for that locomotive. They ran it through the facility, they put all the accoutrements back on it, and they kindly sent that out to California. It took quite a while for it to make its way out to California, and there it resided for many, many years. 1989, they needed to move the locomotive, and they did move it a short distance across the parking lot, and that's where it had resided until we came looking for it. Fun process of getting the locomotive ready to go. We mapped out a strategy, and a lot of it begins with the 3985. That very special locomotive that we have. I laid out of course to restore that locomotive or to continue the work that was needed on that locomotive. So when this opportunity came about, I think they were somewhat shocked when they asked for information on what it would take and what steps would be required to get the big boy going, as I essentially changed the number 3985 to UP 4014, and they had that information right there. So that's kind of how the process started. So we took a lot of our tools and our equipment out there, and we laid out a plan, and that plan came together rather quickly. And as soon as we actually took possession of the locomotive, we were out there working on it. And that required a lot of work. Parking lot, big vast area out there. The railroad was very gracious, very helpful with us. Helpful with us. They gave us all the equipment we needed. We borrowed that big front end loader from the West Colton Maintenance of Way, and we told them we needed it for a few weeks. We kept it for I don't know how many months, but they were always so gracious and always so helpful, and that's the biggest part of the story that we have to tell is how helpful everyone is and how supportive everyone is with what we do. So now we're working, and we had to build ourselves some track. Very ambitious. How are you going to move a 450-ton locomotive a mile to a commuter railroad and get it home again? And we put the plan together. This is how we're going to do it, and this is what we're going to need. So truck after truck showed up with track panels, and we rented other equipment that we needed. And it was a project that we wanted to do from the beginning. You can involve all kinds of different entities to help with a big project like this, but in the end, who moves big equipment? And who best to move it than the railroad and those that are responsible for it and will care for it and do all the work necessary to move it home safely. And there we are in the middle of the parking lot. We're about halfway across the parking lot, and it's important to stop and take pictures every now and then. I wish you always look back, well, I wish we would have taken more pictures. And so I'm glad that we had, this picture is from Steve Kreis. We're grateful that he was there to help us document some of this because we were quite busy. There's another shot of the display prior to the track going in. There were various other tenants in and around the museum display, and we had to work with them and coordinate their activities. And we had a very small window to move across the parking lot. So we had to coordinate everyone's activity around that very short window. So ready or not, we had to move the locomotive. So we made it ready. The important parts were ready, and the other components we could work on once we moved it the initial mile. The track is in place, and we're ready to start positioning the museum equipment outside. That had to be done first. And not only had the big boy not moved for some time, but this museum equipment had been stationary for a long time as well. So we had to disassemble a Climax locomotive and take the rods off of the little 060 and service them and make sure we didn't damage them in any way as we slid them back into some temporary track that we built. So that took a few days of our time, but all part of the plan. And there we are getting ready to move the outer dock, outer harbor dock and warehouse company. The museum does some great restoration work. You can see the nice cab that they recently put on the locomotive. And for a museum that has limited staffing and the abilities to work within such a confined area, for us to come in and start just moving things around, they were just amazed. We would say, well, we're going to move this, this, and this today. And in their line of thinking, you know, they're so accustomed to doing things on a volunteer basis. So next thing you know, by the time the afternoon came around, those two locomotives were out of the way, and we'd swung the track over, and now we're going to take the big boy out. So it was quite a fun time for all of us. A lot of hard work, but it was quite enjoyable. You guys are snickering. Along the lines of doing the work ourselves, we had to drill holes in the panel track. Any number of things that you have to do to build a railroad. Again, it was our plan to do as much of that work as we can. Like all projects, we have to work within the budget constraints that are given to us. So that was very carefully planned that we were going to execute as much of that work as we physically could. So here we are, we've got our staff out there getting familiar with a gas-powered rail drill. And I have to say, we used the same drill bit for 178 holes. And this particular type of drill bit is designed to be disposable. You use it for a couple of holes. Well, because of the nature of that drill, we had a little bit of logistics getting more drill bits. So we were sourcing those drill bits, and in the meantime, we had to keep progress going. So I told the guys, be really careful. And they did, and they resharpened that drill, and they used it for 178 holes. That's got to be a record. But that's the care and the determination that our staff has. And again, that's a reflection of our company and what we do. We're determined to do it, and it's not going to be an easy task. There's going to be times when it's going to be difficult for us, but we're very determined to make it work, and that's an example of that determination. Now we've got the locomotives out, and here comes the big day where we're going to move the locomotive out. And we have to build that track. A little bit of a learning curve when you're building a railroad, especially using second-hand track components. And the parking lot, unfortunately, was not smooth. There was a lot of variances, sewer holes, sewer lines, a lot of things that we had to deviate around. So once we got into our rhythm, we really were able to make some good progress. But those first couple of days, I think the crew was questioning the wisdom of the decision to do this track work ourselves, because we've got the equipment we need, but we really don't have the heavy equipment that you normally would use to build a railroad. There's another thing that we have to do, and this is again part of the methodology, the thought process of a large railroad company, the largest railroad company, and that is safety. Everything that we do, all the processes and every task that we undertake, the primary aspect, the number one thought is that of safety. And it can't be a motto, it can't be a slogan, it can't be something that you hang on the side of a building. and it becomes a slogan. It's not that. We're dealing with equipment that's extremely deadly. Railroading is inherently very, very dangerous. And when you're working with equipment, heavy equipment, locomotives that haven't moved in a long time, specialty equipment, track construction, all of those things, it requires a tremendous amount of coordination and close supervision and adherence to the rules. I know that sounds like something you'd expect a boss to say, but it's something that we're all very committed to. One injury in any corporation, in any business, it's catastrophic for those that are injured, but it's debilitating for a crew, and it's something that just cannot be tolerated. Now we're back in the museum. We've got some parts removed from the locomotive. In this case, we've got the big long piston rods and pistons and the valves and things that we're going to add to the tender, things that we can't have on the locomotive when we operate it. Steam locomotive, when it's operating, requires special lubrication valve oil forced under pressure, under hydraulic pressure, into various parts of the engine to lubricate it. Well, this locomotive will not be operating home, so we've got to take special care and remove all those components and put them in the tender. The tender is very light. The centipede tender on the 3 classes of locomotives is one of the things that you have to be mindful of, particularly backing the locomotive across the parking lot. Locomotive hadn't moved for longer than I'd been alive, so we wanted to take no chances. So we added some water, and we took all those surplus components and put them in the tender. That happens to be one of my favorite locomotive classes. We've got the locomotive out, and we've only got 5 days until we have to physically start moving the locomotive. We've got 5 days to go through and clean all the roller bearings and do a whole series of work underneath the locomotive that we could not do while the locomotive was sitting out in the museum. The asphalt paving was all the way to the top of the display track, so there was no way for even a skinny guy like myself to get underneath and perform the inspections and dismantle all the components that we have to inspect and reestablish all the lubrication that needs to be attended to, and just do everything that we have to do to move the locomotive. So we had to physically get it out to where we could start working on it first. And there it is. And I'm quite proud of the guys. Look at that panel track. It's probably hard to see, but there's a lot of plywood in there. But look at how straight that is. That's pretty good. These guys are good and very determined. Another thing that I was worried about, I kind of stay up late sometimes going through all these scenarios, is California has a lot of earthquakes. And I thought, my goodness, we get this locomotive out on some ground, and even after we've done all the utility assessments and everything, we could encounter some things that are unknown to us. And all of a sudden we've got the locomotive staged somewhere, and we come up with an earthquake, and next thing you know, we come out and the locomotive's kind of leaning a little bit. So we were very, very careful. Every time we left the locomotive, we secured it with multiple chains, but we made sure the track was very, very stable and absolutely level. And luckily, we didn't encounter any earthquakes. There were several while we were there, but we never felt any out at the actual display. They seem to occur at night. And I don't know if anyone's been through an earthquake, but the first earthquake that I experienced, it was something else. I felt like a semi-truck ran into the hotel we were staying at. And I realized, I had goosebumps just explaining it to you. It was quite something, you know, to experience Mother Nature. So that was something in the back of our minds. And here's another view of that track. We've got all types of different plywood and 2x6s, and we've got that track shimmed up. And it's amazing how much plywood can bear. And that was the strategy too, is that we did not want to damage any underground utilities, damage the parking lot in any way. So we were very careful in distributing that weight over a very large surface area. That's a really interesting shot. Once we got on the other side of the parking lot, we had to turn the locomotive. In order to do that, we had to swing the track out in one direction, move the locomotive on that, and then take the track that we were just on and swing it in the opposite direction. And so we were coming up with a process of turning it in a very little tight space over there. The other challenge that we faced is a locomotive had sat for so many years. The centering device spring, all of those parts of the locomotive that need to flex, that need to articulate, hadn't really moved in a very long time. And when the locomotive was in service, the locomotive, as it operates, it oils itself through a system of what we call force feed lubrication. So there's various lubrication points all over the locomotive that are just flooding with locomotive oil. Well, as that locomotive sat stationary for decades, that oil slowly began to coagulate and eventually turn into a very solid mass of an oily mud. And some of it was quite hard. Well, now the challenge is you've got all this very hard stuff that at one time was lubricant, and it's in an area where other parts need to move against each other, roll against each other. So we had to physically get in there and try to free that stuff up. And there's areas that we could not access. So that was the challenge. So it was one thing to start turning the locomotive, and when we first began to turn it, we all marveled because, you know, an articulated locomotive is a fascinating piece of machinery to see move. We finally got it out there, and you could see those components that had broken free. And we cleaned up everything on either side of that, and now there's an area that is a little bit dirty. So we had planned to stop everything and then clean that area up, service those parts that we can now get to, and then begin to move on. The other challenge is the panel track that we used was second hand. A big articulated locomotive, any piece of rail equipment wants to go on straight track. It likes that. When you put it into a curve, you're putting lateral forces on the rail. So we had to be very careful and diligent and guard against rolling that rail over. Had that happened, that would have been very, very problematic. Wouldn't have been the end of the world, but we would have had to get additional equipment out there, and we probably would have damaged things. We would have been careful not to damage the locomotive, but the heavy equipment necessary to physically pick the locomotive back up while you straighten the rail out under the locomotive was something we were not going to do. And that's why it took us as many days as it did, because we were so careful. We could not afford having that locomotive into a curve and then 2 or 3 rail roll right over. And then we'd have an earthquake. That's part of the locomotive side rod hardware. We serviced all that prior to even moving the locomotive at all. We had a plan to strategically go through and remove pieces here and there. Parts of the locomotive, they have to be positioned just so in order to remove the wrist pin, for example, or to be able to access certain parts of the running gear.
Kelly Hook, please come to the front information booth.
So while we would work on one part, we'd access and disassemble everything we could, and then we'd move it again, and then we'd access and disassemble the next part, and then at that time reassemble the other part. And so it was really choreographed to try to get everything done. And we had work gangs working on components that were removed, and we'd stage that material, go through, clean everything, set it aside, get it ready for the reassembly, because time was of the essence. We were in the process of negotiating these timelines, and the timelines seemed to narrow the closer we got. So there was a lot of pressure to get the equipment, everything serviced and ready to go. One of the final moves as we swing around to get it ready. And now we had the great cutover. That was quite an experience for us. We had tremendous cooperation and a lot of coordination with Metrolink and their maintenance away contractor. Outstanding work. Again, lots of planning, lots of coordination. The plan was just to cut the track over. And when you first propose an idea to a commuter rail authority like that, you can imagine the raised eyebrow reaction you're going to get from the engineering people. So we just continued to work through all those processes and assure them that the process would work, and we won't tie up your railroad all night. But there was a little bit of stress and anxiety on the part of many. Now we're coming back, and we're just about halfway to Pomona. Coming in the West Colton Yard. The first few switches we went through, facing point switches, we all began to get a certain comfort level with the locomotive. There were things that we really couldn't identify until we started moving it. And there's always a lot of risk associated with moving any piece of equipment that is stationary for a long time. And that's why we were so careful and so thorough and taking the time in California. So we did not have a big situation on the main line where we had anything at all. As we began to move the locomotive, it was something. And we hadn't moved it that fast going across the parking lot, maybe 2 or 3 miles an hour max. There was a plan early on. We wanted to build a little piece of test track. And we were not able to do that because of the NHRA commitments and the other physical limitations we had. So we didn't have any test track out there. So it was, I really think this is going to work. But with our decision makers, we talked about all these details well before we even officially approached the organization to give the locomotive. So there were no unknowns. The plan was known to all the decision makers, and they made the decision to move ahead with the project. Now it's our job to execute that plan. And there's a lot of pressure, you can imagine, when you have an executive vice president who's in charge of the entire operation of the railroad make a comment to you. You're not bringing that home on the rails, are you? And to which my reply very respectfully, sir, if we can't get it home, it's not worth restoring. Enough said, be safe. So we were very careful and very, very blessed that the Alco Jableman Union Pacific design is so rugged, durable, and such a well-designed machine. And we continued to experience that all the way home. The first few miles we were very slow. I had planned to not go over 10 miles an hour, and we developed a schedule to reflect that. We began going. There was no issues at all. I called the engineer running the engine on the other set. I said, take it up to 18. And we went ahead and off we went. And then you began to hear small little surface imperfections in the tires where they had sat in the same location for years. And that type of wheel defect, we evaluated that very, one of our initial things when we moved the locomotive to confirm that it was not a federal defect that would render some compliance problems for us. They were small little rust particles and the locomotive, think about a steam locomotive tire remaining in the same place for decades. You know, is it safe to move? Is the tire condemned? Will the tire break? I mean, there's a lot of things to explore and a lot of analysis that you have to really get into the engineering side of it and confirm that you've got good equipment. And we did all that. Well, now we're going to move it, and you can hear the thing. And that was the cadence all the way home. And the two engines would get in sync with each other, and it would kind of lope a little bit, and they would get out of sync because the diameters are different. And all the way home, we experienced that. It kind of lulled you into this state as we were going along. But it's a bit unnerving because steam locomotives, they're supposed to be smooth. And even though you've got all those dynamic imbalances, we had the pistons removed, we kept the main rods on, so we did have some good balancing there. But the locomotive does have a special sound, a special feel to it. Now, we've done more work in California, and now we're going to bring the hospital train down from Cheyenne, Wyoming. And that is our support equipment and two very special locomotives that for years were just two locomotives on the roster. We selected months in advance. Again, it's part of a railroad organization that loves its heritage and supports the heritage program. I've got some very good contacts we do in the locomotive planning, in the Harriman Locomotive Planning Group. And they were very eager to set aside the UP 4014 ST70M and the UP 4884. And they ran those through the shops, made sure all the inspections were current, and they forwarded them to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where we assembled into our hospital train, and off we went. And most of us rode the train out there. So that was fun for us. It was fun for me because I didn't run it. You could sit back and ride and have a good time. We're out in California. Everybody wants to ride the train. Who wants to drive the truck? So rather rather than spoil somebody's day and say, hey, you got to drive the truck today, we've got all these beautiful flat cars which serve several purposes. One of which is provide additional braking, and the other is to be in compliance with the one-time move authority that was granted by the Washington office of the Federal Railroad Administration. Because the locomotive brakes on the steam locomotives would not be working, it's a requirement that we maintain at all times at least 85 or higher % in our operative braking. It's a railroad rule. Well, to make sure that we had that, and it's hard to find cars that don't have graffiti on them. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of bothered by the graffiti on the railroad cars. So I figure the flat cars are going to serve a couple of purposes. They're lower profile, they're less likely to see graffiti. They also have good handbrakes. So every night when we tie up, we can secure the train safely, and we can also put our material on there. And this is a special shot for me. This is the 4014 diesel on the right, and the big boy, 4014, on the left. Now we're moving up and we've departed. This is Cajon Pass, one of the many locations where people were just everywhere. And as part of the planning process, the gentleman right here on the left is Bob Brinza. He runs the BNSF. So it was my plan to coordinate very closely with him, and how best to do that is to have him in the engine with us. So should there be any problems at all, should we experience a situation where we have to stop or we encounter anything, he's right there and we can react to do what we have to do to keep our respective railroads fluid. Again, a lot of planning went into place. Excellent. We've enjoyed a very good relationship with the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. We've operated on their routes many times, and they're a great organization to work with. Coming into Victorville, lots and lots of people. Now we've kind of settled into a little bit of a routine. There's still a lot of things we have to do. We have to service the locomotive just like we would if it were in regular service. We've got the connecting rods on, we've got the main rod on, we've got force feed lubrication in our lubricators, we've got the feeds on those lubricators turned up really high, so we've got to fill those lubricators, and we've got to service all the rods, and plus conduct the inspections. Several of us, all of us involved in the servicing, serves one of the primary responsibilities is that of inspecting the locomotive. Every night when we get in there, we are going to inspect that locomotive from one end to the other, and all the other piece of equipment as well. But our focus is on the steam locomotive, making sure that everything is what it needs to be, nothing is rattling apart, and everything is receiving the proper amount of lubrication. We got a little barbecue grill set up, and you can, through the door, you can see the front of the truck. This is the last car on the train, and this is a plow box car. So we had all the food and our sleeping quarters and shower facilities and everything on the train, and that's standard practice when we travel with the steam locomotive. Most of the crew stays in a hotel. For this journey, we're all staying on board the train. Again, if something happens, we don't know what we're going to have to face, and we don't need the added logistics of trying to bus everybody to and from hotels. So we are going to live 8 days on this thing. So we had all our grills and everything we need. And that's Kurt Clark. He's one of our firemen, and he's a pretty good cook too. And this is part of the force feed lubrication on the locomotive, and this is just a picture that I took. One of the things that was completely rebuilt in this particular component, the one it replaced had seized up, so we just replaced it with the part that we brought with us. This photo is credited to Jim Rinn of Trains Magazine. We're very lucky to have had him coming along, documenting it from their perspective, and he was very gracious to provide me with several photos. You can see the train indicator board on the left. It was rather windy coming up through the canyons. Another Jim Rinn photograph. One of the things that we were talking about, this is going by too quick. We wanted it to last a long time because it was such a neat experience. Once we got through the anxiety of something bad happening, it was actually rather enjoyable, and just got into a routine of servicing the locomotive and getting some well-needed rest. Now we're up in Moapa. Everywhere we had stopped, we had planned very carefully, just like a regular steam locomotive trip. And we wanted to make our stopping locations accessible to the public, and we wanted to get that information out in advance so people could plan so they could come out and participate in the move and see the locomotive. This is one of our first stops out of Vegas. The pilot crews that we had were really excited. We operated both of the locomotives. They were both manned. And we had a little briefing sheet up there in the front, taped to the control stand, kind of giving them the do's and the don'ts. And we would go through and I would job brief each successive crew. We went through 28 crews. And again, that was all planned to be a part of the whole operation. But every time we got a new crew on board, we'd go through our process of letting them know what we do. We've got the engine in the front, the engine in the back, and the engineer in the front. Don't go beyond 4 throttle, dynamic brake only from the 4884, and I'll coordinate whatever else we got to deal with. Here we go. Have fun. It gives you an idea of the size of the 4000 class locomotive. Very, very massive machine. Another shot coming into Tintic, coming into Salt Lake City. And now we're in Salt Lake City. We enjoyed thousands of people, a great turnout in Salt Lake. Also a little bit of time for the crew to get some rest. And at every display, we plan an additional day. The display day is a display for the public, but it's also an opportunity for us to do what we need to do. If there's anything that needs to be addressed on the locomotive, any parts that need to be adjusted or fabricated, or anything at all, that's an opportunity for us to get that done, so our next series of travel days will go smoothly. Ogden, Utah. Very special place for the big boy. There were several retired railroaders and their families that came down and shared some stories with us. Very heartwarming. We had an individual that had some hand-drawn paintings and drawings that is his father, who had recently passed away, and he'd worked in the shop. He shared those with us. And that's true when we travel with all the locomotives, the 844, the Challenger, you know, the impact they have on people. It's really, really special for us to be able to do this. Now we're going to make another inspection. This is looking underneath what's known as a cannon box, and that's the roller bearing housing. And you can see how clean that plug is. And we've got a series of little chalk marks out there. We've cleaned it and we've checked it and we continue to inspect it. And every time we inspect it, we go through and we mark it with chalk to know that we've done that. Lubricator lines. These particular lines are the lines that were on the locomotive when it was donated. A vast majority of those lines were still serviceable. Some of them were rotted and we had to replace them. But a very good number of those lines, all we had to do was simply flush them out and go. 4-speed lubricator. See, it's half full on the sight glass. Is that the one that was on it? Is that one of our rebuilds?
That was on it.
That's the original lubricator that was on it. We brought down some cores and a whole bunch of parts. If we had to, we would put our cores and our supply of lubricators from our inventory. We would use those. But we discovered that they were in serviceable condition. We could just clean them up and rehabilitate them. And again, it's a tribute to the design. There's two Railway Locomotive Historical Society members, Paul Gershio and Rick Brown. As part of the plan to move the locomotive back, we would have loved to accommodate all of the membership, but unfortunately we just couldn't do that. And so we left it up to them to determine who they were going to send home with us, and we would take them as far as they want to go. If you want to go all the way home with us, we can do that. We gave them a bunk in our car, and we made arrangements so they could get their have food and everything they needed. And they just melded right into our crew, and they were also really instrumental in the parking lot and in the museum itself, helping us do some very important tasks. So a very good relationship with the organization. And here we have Ted and Austin, probably filling the flange oilers on the engine truck. And we're sitting in the siding letting a double stack go by. And going up Echo Canyon. That was a special day for everyone, especially us. We've been up that canyon a couple of times in the 844, and we're looking forward to taking this locomotive through there under steam. Another beautiful Jim Wren photograph. Again, you know, every time I look at these, I'm struck with the size of the locomotive. We worked around it a long time. We got comfortable with it, but when we made it a conventional locomotive up to it, we really could see what we had a hold of. And I'll segue off just real quick on that. The very first discussion I ever had, I was invited back to the headquarters, and I was summoned to the top floor of the building. And they got right to the point. Hey, we're considering a big boy. Is that something you would be interested in doing? And, you know, I want to be professional. I want to contain my enthusiasm. But most importantly, this is a very serious line of work that we're in. This isn't a fun, it's always a fun thing. And I wanted to make sure that everybody understood what we were getting ourselves into, what we were committing to, the fuel consumption, the water, the logistics, the grease consumption. And I explained to them, this is two 844s. Think of it in that respect. You've got 4884. So talk about our water consumption, our fuel consumption, and then we segued off into the very important conversation about infrastructure, and that's going to be our next part of the presentation, is we need infrastructure improvements and expansion to maintain locomotives, not only the big boy, but the 844 and the other locomotives that we have. We're blessed that those that worked in the shop before us were very diligent and very careful to preserve the program through years in which they probably didn't enjoy the support that they would have liked, but they kept the program running, and we owe our hats are off to them. So the task now falls to us to take it into that next generation. And so the 4014 project was the ideal springboard, the ideal opportunity to discuss what our infrastructure requirements are, and what is the STEAM program, what is our mission, what do we do, and how we're going to do it, what resources we're going to need to fulfill that mission. So it took me about 10 minutes to lay that plan out. And then a decision was made that we would proceed with the idea, and I got the order, and I'll never forget that day, go find us a big boy. So here we are. This is at Evanston, Wyoming. Big crowds at Evanston. We had UPH, Union Pacific Historical Society members operating both locomotives. So they were having a great time. Excellent engineers, great to work with. Here we are at the line relocation at Wasatch. Another view, you kind of get the perspective of the locomotive. Just look at the line and how it towers over the diesels and how it towers over the passenger cars. Coming into Green River. Another moment of servicing. And this is the granite quarry. Laramie. That was a very special day as well. They all were. Lots of crowds at Laramie. Unbelievable amount of people. Jim Wren commented to me several times that he couldn't believe how many people were following a locomotive that's not running. And now we're coming into Cheyenne. The moment that we've been thinking about for a long time. We had planned through our corporate communications and our government affairs staff that the mayor of Cheyenne and his wife would like to ride the locomotive into Cheyenne. So 5 weeks prior to this, and there's a little bit of pressure when you make a commitment like this, but mayor will pick you up at Wycon, which is a road crossing out there, at 12:45 on May 8th. So weeks later, we travel 1,300 miles, and at 12:44 and 58 seconds, we stopped and picked up the mayor of Cheyenne. And we equipped him with the company-approved safety equipment, gave him a quick briefing, and he and his wife boarded the locomotive, and into town we went. And there's a shot in the cab. All of us at various points rode there. I rode the locomotive every foot of the way in the event there were issues, and that was kind of our command post to communicate with the dispatcher and to interface with the two locomotive engineers. And it got a little bit cold as soon as we left Green River. Now here we are at home. We've just backed the locomotive into the steam shop. Now this was presented to the Executive Vice President of Operations not long after we got home. We had several of these number plates made and presented one to the Superintendent of the Los Angeles Service Unit, presented one to our partners at Metrolink, the Southern California Regional Rail Authority, and presented one to our boss, very important, Diane Duran. She is our boss, and she has a vision for our program which is reflected in the 4014 project. And the Executive Vice President of Operations, they run the operating department. So I was very pleased when I had the opportunity to take the plaque up and present it in a small ceremony. I was very pleased. Guess what I saw in that beautiful corner office at the Union Pacific headquarters? I saw 3 O-gauge models. One of them was the UP 3985. One of them was the UP 844. And the other one was the UP 4014.
Operating system-wide?
Well, that's another very good question, and that too was a topic of that first conversation we had. And there are places that it won't be able to go, but there are places that it'll be able to go that the 844 can't go. So you will see it far and wide, and we will do whatever engineering we need to do, within reason, of course, just like we do on the 844. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes engineering that we do to shoehorn that equipment in where we need to. Our railroad has done nothing but expand. Anytime there's a major terminal renovation, the degree of curvature usually doesn't get tighter, it usually lessens. So that's a benefit to a steam locomotive. There's areas that we can take it. And the locomotive's articulated. You'll be surprised, we've already had it in a 16-degree curve. And 844 can't do that. So that's the good news. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.